Welcome to a special episode of the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. I'm sitting today with a very respected professor of Jewish spirituality and the gentleman responsible for the English translation of the Zohar, which has taken 2 decades, Professor Daniel Matt. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Please tell me a little bit about how you started out, a little bit about your childhood and what interested you in Jewish mysticism and Jewish spirituality.
Right. Well, my father was a rabbi in New York, in upstate New York, Troy, New York, conservative rabbi, and he never really promoted mysticism to me. In those days, not many people were interested in mysticism per se, but I always felt a very genuine spirituality from him. And I remember, just sitting next to him in synagogue and as part of the prayers on Sabbath and feeling a real warmth and devotion. So there was really a combination of parental child love and religious devotion that were combined in my relation with him. And that led me to studying Bible, studying with him and on my own. And I think it really directed me to look for the spiritual element within Judaism. And that was first introduced to me through the writings of Martin Buber. And then I got interested in Hasidism, the revivalist movement of Jewish mysticism that began in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the Hasidic texts would often quote this book called the Zohar. I'd never heard much about the Zohar, but these Hasidic texts that were very beautiful about finding God in nature and the presence of God in everyday life. Every few pages, the Hasidic text would quote one line or one phrase from the Zohar, and it always intrigued me. The Zohar was in Aramaic, so that was something of a challenge to understand. My Hebrew was pretty good at that point, but my Aramaic was just minimal. And I wanted to explore the Zohar, so my first encounter with it really, in any serious way, was my junior year abroad. I spent my junior year in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. And there, I knew that I had just 1 year, so I took beginning Zohar and advanced Zohar at the same time. And I was kind of lost in advanced Zohar, but that didn't matter because I was lost in beginning Zohar too. It's such a challenging book. It's a mystical commentary on the Torah, on the 5 books of Moses. And the Zohar penetrates the outer layer of meaning and looks for a deeper spiritual sense, often posing very challenging questions. For example, the Zohar will say on the Garden of Eden story, when the Genesis says that God expelled Adam from the garden, the Zohar says, well, who kicked who out of the garden? And it turns out the Zohar is really teaching that Adam kicked God out of the garden. Adam lost his sense of oneness with the divine, and that really alienated him from a sense of fulfillment and from an intimacy with God. Or the opening verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The Zohar reads that differently. In the beginning it created God. The Hebrew can really give that sense. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning God created, but the actual order of the Hebrew words could allow you to translate it, in the beginning created God. The Zohar takes that to mean that the ultimate God is unnameable, the infinite. And what we think of as God is really something very limited, because our imagination, our projection, fashions this image of God which doesn't do justice to the full infinity of God.
Now, you've also written quite a few incredible books, including comparing the Jewish way of the beginning of the earth to the Big Bang. The Tohu Va'ohu, is that correctly? Is that in any way related to the Big Bang? I mean, the chaos, the darkness.
Yeah, Tohu Va'ohu is how Genesis describes the state of existence before God creates light. So the world was chaotic and without form. It's hard to translate those Hebrew words, but it means formless and without structure. And it's as if there's darkness there. There also seems to be water. It never says in the Bible that God created water. So there seem to be these primeval elements, but they're in a state of chaos, and God gives order and God fashions light. So one of the parallels that I found is that just the essential ingredient of light, and light being really not something separate from God, but the divine light itself. So this explosion of light, or this appearance of light at the beginning, is one parallel with modern cosmology. Another is what's called broken symmetry, that physics really offers that description. That there was originally a oneness, a state of being, but that broke or splintered into the multitude, and that breaking is really what allows for creation to come about. If there had if there had just been energy and no differences in the patterns of energy, we wouldn't have galaxies or stars or creation. So there's some initial disruption of harmony that leads to the world as we know it today. And the Jewish mystics speak not of broken symmetry, but what they call the breaking of the vessels. The divine light was coming into the world, but the vessels conveying that light couldn't handle the power of the light. They shattered. And that shattering really produces the multiplicity and the duality that we live in today. So there are parallels like that I explored in this book, God and the Big Bang.
Now tell me, in regards to the timing, just a question about the timing. If the Jewish calendar began roughly 6,000 years ago, and before that, there was the Big Bang supposedly happened billions of years ago,
right? And
then there's also potentially the Enki and the Sumerians and whatever else could have been there. What would be how do those calendars match? Like the Torah and the Big Bang, what was in between all that?
Yeah, some people try to match up the 6,000 years of traditional chronology with the 13.8 billion years that scientists would say today, that maybe that first week of creation wasn't a week as we know it, but each day was, a certain number of million or billions of years. But that's not my approach, really. I don't really look for the Bible for literal scientific truth. I see it as a story of creation, and due to a certain amount of human imagination and human creativity. And what I really try to do is to navigate between the scientific account and the traditional biblical account. Where there are parallels, that's wonderful. I look for those and celebrate those. But where there are differences, I would look to science for, the raw facts, and to the biblical account for questions of meaning and inspiration. And it doesn't bother me that the chronologies are so far apart. I think we should be humble enough to say we can learn from both of them, not to insist that either science is correct and religion is just fairy tales, or on the other hand that the Bible is God's ultimate truth, and we should ignore rational and scientific approach. I think both of those are limited, and we should try to learn from both approaches.
That's beautiful. Now, the Zohar itself, the Kabbalah started from a text called the Sefer Yetzirah, right?
That is an early text. Some people would say it's even before Kabbalah. It's hard to say exactly when Kabbalah begins. But the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, or the book of creation, was probably written around the 2nd century of the Common Era. So that's almost 1,000 years before the Zohar. The Zohar is really 13th century Spain, although it has earlier roots. Mm-hmm. The Sefer Yetzirah, a millennium earlier, 2nd century, in the land of Israel. There's a little book, it's almost a booklet. That's where you first find the reference to the 10 Sefirot, which there probably means 10 primordial numbers, that God creates the world through numbers and letters.
And in terms of, now the Sefer Yetzirah, was that written in Aramaic as well?
That's in Hebrew.
Okay, so now the Zohar, for those who may not know, originally it was written by a rabbi, and there's several myths about it. One of them is that the rabbi was kind of buried to his neck in a way. What is the history behind the actual writing of the Zohar?
Yeah, well, the Zohar was most likely composed in Spain in the 13th century, probably in a circle of Kabbalists. I think the main composer was a man named Moses de Leon. Moses from the city or district of Leon in northwestern Spain. He never admitted that he wrote the book. He claimed he was copying from an ancient manuscript, and that the original went back to a rabbi who lived back in the 2nd century, 1100 years earlier, a man named Shimon, the son of Yochai, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the Shimon Bar Yochai is a very colorful character. He's described in the Talmud. He's a major figure in early rabbinic literature. And he apparently had great conflicts with the Romans. The Romans really tried to catch him, and they probably wanted to imprison or execute him because he was teaching Torah publicly, and maybe he was also supporting some of the rebels against Rome. So there's a story that Rabbi Shimon and his son hid in a cave for 12 years, and then an additional year, 13 years. And there's a legend that they were buried in sand so that their clothes wouldn't wear out. They buried themselves in sand, but they kept their heads and enough of their body out that they could study Torah during the day. So the legend is that in that cave in which they were hiding, it was there that the ideas of the Zohar emerged, that they began to compose the Zohar. But historically, the Zohar is probably almost a millennium later, written in Spain by this Moses de Leon and his colleagues. But they did draw on earlier rabbinic teachings, and they certainly were inspired by teachings of Rabbi Shimon and many other traditions as well.
Now, the Zohar is translated as, just the title.
The word means radiance or splendor.
And originally, how long was it, approximately?
The main body of the Zohar is a commentary on the Torah, and that, in its original Aramaic text, comprises 3 volumes, I would say about 1,000 pages of Aramaic. Translated into English, that would require more because Aramaic is a very dense language. Our English edition is 12 volumes. That really covers the 3 Aramaic volumes and a fourth of additional material that was found later. So I would say in Aramaic it's 4 volumes that turned into 12 in English because we included a very extensive commentary. So a typical page has translation at the top, translation of the Zohar, and then commentary. The commentary explains the symbolism, tries to identify earlier teachings in rabbinic sources, and just tries to make sense of it for a contemporary reader.
Great. And now, in terms of contemporary meaning, what are some of the examples, for example, that you were to take from the original text and bring them to current day meaning?
Well, I would say there are 3 essential teachings of the Kabbalah, and people often use Kabbalah and Zohar interchangeably. Kabbalah is a name for the whole movement, the whole philosophy of Jewish mysticism, and the Zohar is the major text of that movement. There's no book called the Kabbalah. When people say they're studying the Kabbalah, they really mean they're studying the Zohar. The Zohar is the main book of the Kabbalah. So of these 3 ideas, I think the first is that God is ultimately unnameable. The term that the Kabbalah uses is Ein Sof. E-I-N, Ein, there is not. Sof, S-O-F, and end. There is no end. So Ein Sof means the infinite, and that's the only accurate name of God, really, according to Kabbalah, infinity. God is beyond all of our names. All of the biblical names for God, Yahweh or Yud-He Vav-He, I pronounce it just those 4 letters, Yud-He Vav-He, because even that name, no one is really sure how it's pronounced. But that name, or Elohim, Adonai, Shaddai, Tzivaot, there are many biblical names for God. The Zohar would say each of those only really reveals one aspect of the divine totality. And Ein Sof is the best you can really say about God, that God is infinite. So ultimately God is infinite. I would say that's one insight of the Kabbalah. The second is, if we're going to talk about God, we should balance the patriarchal image of God with the feminine. And that maybe is the most relevant breakthrough of the Kabbalah for contemporary readers, for contemporary seekers, that God is equally male and female, ultimately beyond all gender. Ein Sof, infinity, is not male or female, but so much of religious literature describes God as father, as king, as ruler. So the Kabbalah insists that if we're going to talk about God, we have to use the feminine as much as the masculine. And the name for the feminine half of God is Shekhinah. You could spell that Shekhinah. Shekhinah. Literally, it means the presence of God in the world.
It's the divine intersex in a way.
The divine
intersex.
The romance between the feminine and the masculine halves of God is really the main plot, the main drama of the Zohar. Their union gives blessing to the world, and it's interesting how that union comes about. The male and female halves of God do not unite unless we contribute, unless we stimulate their romance. You might say that every good deed that we do is an aphrodisiac for the divine couple. So if we act virtuously, we stimulate the divine love, and then the male and female unite, and blessing flows to the world. If people act wickedly or mindlessly or selfishly, then the divine couple remains split, almost divorced.
In a way, it's very similar to the Jungian anima and animus.
Yes.
And connecting that within yourself.
Right. Jung is really a helpful way to understand the dynamics of the divine life, and it shows you that it's not just something up there, it's something within the human soul. So in studying the Zohar, you're really exploring your own inner workings, and Carl Jung is very helpful for that psychological understanding.
And the third one?
The third, so God is infinite, God is male and female. The third is that God needs us. So this is related to what we were just saying about the union can't happen without human stimulation, without human contribution. God is incomplete without our active participation. And that's a very radical notion. Usually you think of God as perfect and human beings as imperfect. And in a sense that's true, but God is incomplete unless we carry out the holy work in the world. One name that the Zohar, that the Kabbalah has for God is the secret of the possible. So God is potentially real, but we have to actualize that potential by the way that we act.
I think a couple of questions about numbers. Are there 72 names of God or more?
There are various lists of divine names. Sometimes you find 70 names, and there is one passage in the Zohar which speaks of 72 triplets, 72 three-letter combinations, each of which is a holy name. And through the power of that name, God split the waters of the Red Sea. So there are many different accounts of letters and different combinations of letters that form the divine name.
Now, what about age 40? Is that an older thought process of beginning to study the Zohar?
That you shouldn't delve into mysticism until you've reached a certain age. That appears in Kabbalah. It really comes from the world of Islam originally. Originally, it was a restriction in Islam about when you could study philosophy. You shouldn't study philosophy until you're 40. That was taken over by Jewish teachers also, and then it was applied not only to philosophy, but to Kabbalah. But there are other Kabbalists who said 20. You should be 20 years old. I think the point is you have to reach a certain level of maturity, because the teachings are so beautiful and so seductive, you could be entranced by them, and what the Sufis say, you could become drunk on God and lose your bearings in the world, not be responsible to your family, to your spouse, to your children, to your community. So I think there's a psychological danger and a social danger in delving into mysticism too quickly. The psychological danger is that you could really fool yourself into thinking that I am perfect. Whatever I think, whatever I do is holy. I feel the divine light. I feel the divine energy, so there are no limits. And that's very dangerous because people justify their own selfish or evil behavior thinking that they are God. So there's the psychological danger. The social danger is both that and also thinking, who needs the rabbi? Who needs the tradition? Whatever I do is holy. So the Kabbalists were aware of the beauty of this material and how profound it is, and also how dangerous it is to dive into it without some preparation.
And also being possessed by the archetype, right? Possessed by the...
Yes.
Now,
yes.
Margot
Pritzker. Yes.
The story behind it. How did she approach you? How was that?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story. This woman, Margot Pritzker, part of a very wealthy family in Chicago. The Pritzker family owns the Hyatt chain of hotels and other business ventures. She was very attracted to Kabbalah, and she began studying with a rabbi in Chicago, a man named Yechiel Pupko. Rabbi Yechiel Pupko. She began studying with Rabbi Pupko, studying the Torah and the Midrash, the rabbinic commentaries on the Torah. And then they began studying the Zohar using an older English translation, what's called the Sansino translation. This was done back in the 1930s, and it's more of a paraphrase than an accurate translation of the Zohar. It skips some of the difficult passages and some of the erotic passages. Now, if you add up the difficult passages and the erotic passages, that's a big chunk of the Zohar. So it skips parts of the Zohar. And after they were using it for some time, either the rabbi said to Mrs. Pritzker or she said to him, let's do a new translation. So out of their own Torah study, out of their own study of the Zohar, they felt the need to have a new translation. And they approached me and asked me if I would take it on, not directly, through a mutual friend. And when I heard this proposal, I was amazed and overwhelmed, and I said to my friend who had conveyed the proposal, I have to think about this. He said, sure. So I thought about it for a few days, for a week, for several weeks, for a month, for a few months, and I just couldn't decide. I couldn't let go of the possibility of doing it, but I realized it would be really an immense undertaking. I didn't know if I could really succeed. So excuse me, I decided to take off a few weeks from my teaching. I had a semester break, really. And for a few weeks, for almost a whole month, I tried it out. Without yet having spoken to the Pritzkers at all. I just tried it for a month. And after that month, I did it every day for as long as I could handle it. After that month, I decided I'm definitely not doing this. It was just too draining. It was too exhausting. So I told my friend, look, this is an amazing opportunity, but I have to say no. He said, I understand, but why don't you at least meet with the Pritzkers and tell them no? So that was my mistake. I agreed to meet with them and met Margot Pritzker for the first time and Rabbi Pupko, and I said, look, this is an amazing opportunity, but there already are anthologies of the Zohar, and I had already done a small selection of passages from the Zohar. I said, but I just, I don't think I can do this. So Mrs. Pritzker said, I understand you're hesitant, but if you did do it, how long would it take? And I said, 12 to 15 years. She said, you're not scaring me. And somehow when she said that, something flipped inside of me. I think I was reading it like almost a dare. She was saying, I'm not scared. How come you're scared? That's how I understood, her response. You're not scaring me. So I said, okay, I'll do it. I just blurted out that I would do it. And so then I began working at it, and it ended up taking longer than we had thought, because what I did was to look at original manuscripts of the Zohar, not just the first printed edition, but handwritten copies of the Zohar, because what happened over the centuries, every scribe who copied it, and then the editors, especially of the first printed edition, they put in their own 2 cents. They tried to make the Zohar easier to understand, or if there was a very strange word, they would change it into something a little more normal. And what I did was to erase these hundreds of years of scribal editions. I tried to get back to the original of the Zohar. Now, I don't think we'll ever find the original, because Moses de Leon and his companions in Spain didn't write it as one document. They wrote it Zohar on Genesis, the Zohar on Exodus. These were separate passages, separate sections. But every scribe who copied it from then until when it was printed, hundreds of years later, changed and added and revised. And by going back to the earliest manuscripts, I was able to retrieve, to reconstruct something closer to the original text. And so that Aramaic text I had to fashion before I could translate. Page by page, I revised the page and translated it. Revised the next page and translated it by looking at the original readings in the manuscript. So that slowed it down, but I think it made it a more beautiful, poetic text.
So the first printed edition was printed in Italy?
In Italy, in about 1558. Actually, 2 competing publishers, one in Mantua, Italy, one in Cremona. We have here the Cremona edition of the Zohar, and the same year in Mantua, Italy, another edition came out, and those were the first printed editions. Even that's about 300 years after it was written in Spain.
Is there any information about how they compiled the...
They drew on manuscripts too. They drew on various manuscripts. They tried to establish the best text, but sometimes they tamed the original unruly Aramaic. If there was something pretty bizarre in the original, they would try to convey it in more normal Aramaic. Or I'll give an example. If the author of the Zohar might have taken something from the Talmud and revised it a little bit in his own creative way, sometimes the editors would go back to the Talmud and put the original wording of the Talmud. But I didn't want what the Talmud said. I wanted how the Zohar had changed the Talmud. So some changes that Moses de Leon made were undone by the scribes or the editors.
Are there any missing elements in the Zohar that were not added? For example, the erotic ones or etc.?
Occasionally the printed editions will tone down a little bit of the erotic quality of the Zohar. But just the fact that it's in Aramaic hides it already. In other words, why was the Zohar written in Aramaic? Mm-hmm. Most books of the Kabbalah were written in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And Moses de Leon, the author, knew Hebrew much better than he knew Aramaic. Mm-hmm. Why did he write it in Aramaic? Maybe to make it look ancient, and maybe to hide some of the radical ideas that God is infinite, that God is male and female, that there's a union within the divine forces. There's a romantic, erotic union of masculine and feminine. So he wanted to convey those ideas, but he wanted to make it, something of a mystery, something of a search. The Zohar doesn't come out and hand you its teachings. The Zohar makes you search. And in searching for the meaning, you're also searching within yourself. You think that you're trying to make sense of the word on the page, but that forces you to look within, to look deep within. So there's a double searching going on. And the Aramaic forces you to slow down, maybe to consult with a teacher or a friend. It's the kind of text that really has to be studied in a group. It doesn't have to be. There's value in doing it on your own too. But the rabbis in the Zohar are always discussing things. It's always Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yossi were walking on the road, and one of them asks the other one a question. Everything is outdoors. Everything is in nature. Very rarely are they sitting inside the house, unless it's midnight. They'll get up at midnight to study, then they're indoors. But during the day, they're often sitting in the field under a tree. They'll say, how beautiful is this tree? Let us crown this tree with words of Torah. And then they'll delve into the next verse.
How did you learn Aramaic? And to the point where you can read and write and understand it fully?
I studied Aramaic by studying the Talmud. The main body of rabbinic teaching is written in Aramaic. And that's probably how Moses de Leon learned his Aramaic too, because in Spain in the 13th century, people were not speaking or writing in Aramaic. So Moses de Leon learned Aramaic from studying the Talmud and studying what's called the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Bible. Those were his main sources of Aramaic, and I did that too. At an early point in the project, I took on the discipline of what's called Daf Yomi, a daily page of the Talmud. If you study one page of the Talmud, actually it's a double page because it's two sides of a leaf, two sides of a normal page. If you study those 2 pages every day, 2 pages a day, you can go through the entire Talmud in about 7 years.
Which Talmud do you prefer?
There's what's called the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The more commonly studied one is the Babylonian.
That's the one you were...
That's what I studied through, but the Jerusalem Talmud is also important. A lot of the material is found in both.
Now, the covers are yellow. What is the significance of yellow?
It's kind of a goldish yellow. That wasn't picked because of any Kabbalistic symbolism. It was just the publisher wanted a dramatic and rich color. What's beautiful is that on the inside cover, the inside of the front and back cover, they have a photograph, a reproduction of the first editions of the Zohar.
Which is the one you showed me.
Right, the Cremona Zohar that we looked at, and the Mantua Zohar. They have them.
You had a chance to hold them both in your hands.
I've worked with original copies and with earlier manuscripts that are all over European libraries.
What are the early manuscripts on? Parchment paper? Or?
They're on vellum, or not so much parchment, but vellum, and then just old paper.
Can you are they smudged? Can you read them clearly?
Yeah, usually you can read them. There'll be missing pages and parts that are smudged. Many of them are on microfilm, and I worked from copies reproduced from the microfilm, but I've also seen a good number of them in the original libraries.
Did you get a chance to travel abroad to research and?
Did a lot of research. I mean, I spent really 4 of the first 5 years of the project in Jerusalem, working in Jerusalem, translating it, and that was wonderful because there are many scholars there I could consult with. But I've traveled to libraries in Italy and England and France and Canada.
Back in 2015, I did an original presentation in a Jungian conference in Sicily. Jung's family was there. It's called Intersex as a Transcendent Function, and it dealt with the divine intersex, the like Dionysus and the male and female, which brings in together that. So I love that's added to this, because I also feel that divinity is united.
Yeah, that's a central theme in the Zohar. I would say it's really the central mystery of the Zohar is that union within God.
Now, if I was to ask you 2 parts of the Zohar, where would one find them? Let's say the part where one wants to travel for protection in the Pinchas, right? Sometimes they sell like many versions for traveling. Where is that located in the Zohar? And also, where are the erotic elements? Just for those who are interested.
The erotic elements are really throughout.
Okay.
The erotic elements are really almost, every few pages there'll be a reference to the union of Shekhinah and the Holy One, blessed be He. When Rabbi Shimon is revealing, Rabbi Shimon is the hero of the Zohar. Moses de Leon is composing it, but he presents the Zohar as the teachings of Rabbi Shimon. When Rabbi Shimon is about to depart from the world, near the very end of the Zohar, his death is actually called Hilula, which means a wedding celebration. So why is his death a wedding? Because he himself is going to unite with the Shekhinah, with the feminine of God. And as part of his departure, he describes the union of the divine male and female very dramatically. So that section will be the end of volume 9, is Rabbi Shimon's last teachings.
That's exquisite.
Yeah.
So death as a wedding because you're uniting with the feminine part of God.
Right.
That's extraordinary.
Yes.
That's a great way of kind of looking forward to death. And not that it's not that you should hurry it, but...
Right. That's what he says, that it's really, one shouldn't mourn, one should celebrate the reunion.
That's beautiful.
With the divine.
And what about the...
Pinchas is one Torah portion, right? The Zohar is written as a commentary on the Torah, and Pinchas is the biblical figure. Pinchas or Phineas. He's described and his actions are recorded in the book of Numbers, and in our edition, that's actually also in volume 9. Volume 9 of the Pritzker Edition concludes the Zohar on the Torah, and it's there that Pinchas is found.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you this: people are wondering, will this be available, digitally?
Yes, there will be an ebook. Stanford University Press is the publisher, and they're planning on issuing an ebook within the next few months.
Amazing.
Sometime in 2018.
What about translations to other languages, Japanese or etc., etc.?
This may be the basis for other translations. There is a French translation already of parts of the Zohar, and there's selections in other languages, but the Pritzker Edition may well serve as the basis for a translation. I should say too, the Aramaic text that I reconstructed from the manuscripts, that's available for free on Stanford's website. If those of you who know or want to access the Aramaic, if you Google Stanford Zohar or Stanford Zohar Aramaic, that will pop up. That can be printed out. I tell people the English you have to buy, but the Aramaic is for free.
Now, there's a thought that having a Zohar near you, having it open, scanning it, or looking at it by itself can fill your soul and your being with knowledge, without necessarily delving into it unless you're ready for that. How do you feel about that?
I'm somewhat skeptical about that. I mean, I would say that the text is powerful. The power comes partly from the text itself and partly from what the reader brings or is open to. So I wouldn't deny that holding a Zohar or opening the Zohar and gazing at it could have a certain effect. But I think the fact that the Kabbalists themselves say that the sound of the Aramaic has an impact on the person. But I think the most powerful way to experience it is to read a little bit. It's dangerous to read too much at once, but to read a little bit and ponder it And the way I've set it up with the text and the commentary, I don't think one should immediately go to the commentary. I think read the text on its own, ponder it, let it have its effect on you, and then try to delve into the commentary and make sense of it. But I think looking at the words and hearing the sound of the words in the Aramaic or the English is more potent than just holding it or scanning it.
It really develops critical thinking abilities.
It's the kind of text that makes you ask questions. It's the kind of text that, often in mysticism it's said that you should put aside the rational mind. And I think at a certain point that's true. But for the Zohar, you have to use the rational mind very intensely up to a certain point and then let go. If you immediately let go, you don't get much out of it. And if you don't let go at all, you miss the power that's there too.
Do you feel that it's more beneficial to study it on your own or in a group of people?
I think both are important. I think it's useful to have a guide or a group, I think at least to start out with. I tried to write the commentary so that the intelligent lay reader could make sense of it on her or his own. But if you have the opportunity to study with a rabbi or teacher in a group, I think that's great. A few people together trying to make sense of it, or even just two people bouncing off of each other, is useful. But I tried to write the commentary so that one could approach it on one's own.
And then just a couple more questions. It's a super fascinating interview. Incredible. Okay. The book is available on Amazon and at all major retailers.
Yeah, Amazon is the easiest way. It's called the Zohar Pritzker Edition.
How were you able to kind of take away the subjective, the emotional aspect, and really stay objective during the whole process?
I mean, I tried to be both. I tried to let it have its power on me, to open myself up to the power of the text, but to let go of my own preferences. What I found is, for example, in translators always have this problem. Do you translate literally, or do you try to paraphrase it and, turn it into something else? And I really found that with the Zohar, when I was being as close as possible to the literal meaning, when I was letting go of my own preferences, my own desires to update it or to make it relevant or to make it contemporary, if I could let go of that, then more of the power came through. So I would often, gaze out at the horizon, or go for a walk or go for a swim. If I ran into a real difficult passage and just couldn't make sense of it, I would let go of the book for a while, put the text aside, and something would work itself out inside of me.
And what kind of overall effect did this process have on you?
That's hard to say. I think you'd have to ask my wife. But I would say it's given me more of an appreciation of not being satisfied with the surface layer of anything, of a text, of a person, of an encounter, of a situation, a social situation, personal situation. To ask, is there something deeper going on? Can I scratch the surface? Because the Zohar does that when it's trying to understand a verse in the Bible, and I've realized that that's useful. Another thing is to appreciate balance. The Zohar talks a lot about the extremes and polar opposites and how to try to find the harmony, try to find the balance. And I've tried to incorporate that into my life, not to be swayed by my immediate emotional reaction to something, but to see the other side and hopefully end up somewhere in the middle.
And talking about layers, when you study the Zohar, are there unlimited layers or are there multiple layers?
There are at least multiple layers. The Zohar talks about 4 levels of meaning often in a biblical verse, but I think the 4 can turn into many times 4. So I think there probably are limitless, infinite possibilities of meaning in the text. And I think one great value of the Zohar is not even so much what it says. What it says is often amazing, but that it's just the fact that it's so bold and creative and imaginative. So it stimulates you to take that approach to a verse in the Bible or to an experience you're having, to look for a new way a new possibility of meaning.
Can you briefly describe those 4 levels?
they're referred to as the literal, the midrashic, which is really how the rabbis unfold the Bible with their imagination. Then an allegorical meaning, maybe giving some philosophical sense to a verse. And finally, the mystical meaning, where you're encountering the divine presence right there on the page. So literal, midrashic, allegorical, and mystical.
Would the Zohar be considered the great Jewish grimoire?
The great Jewish
grimoire, like the great Jewish book of secrets and book of shadows and book of magic.
Certainly. It's the great treasury of Jewish mysticism, of Jewish spirituality.
And what's next for you?
I'm working now on a biography of Elijah the prophet, tracing how he changes and develops from a biblical religious extremist, a perfectionist or a fanatic, and how he becomes more compassionate, almost a Jewish bodhisattva, you might say, because according to the Bible, he doesn't die. He's taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. Excuse me. So I'm trying to trace how he is educated and how he mellows and turns into someone who seeks to help people.
And the final question for today is, once the marriage occurs after death, and there's a reuniting of the spirit, is there anything in the Zohar that discusses what happens then?
The Zohar sees that as the birth of all souls. Human souls are born through the union of the divine couple. The Shekhinah and the Holy One, blessed be He, generate a human soul. And then when a human couple unites physically, the soul enters that fetus. So there's a partnership between divine creativity and human creativity.
Thank you so much. It's been a tremendous pleasure speaking with you.
You're welcome, Michael.
Enjoy the Zohar, and the book is available and will soon be available digitally. Thank you.